Hi, and welcome to this short video presentation from the Human Systems Intervention channel. I'm James Conklin, and today I'm going to be speaking with Caroline Samne. Caroline is a graduate from the Human Systems Intervention Master's Program at Concordia University in Montreal, and she's been working in the field of community and organization development for more than 15 years. Her work has included large-scale change interventions, group facilitation, change management, strategic planning, group development, team building, and evaluation process development. Caroline believes that successful change in organizations is largely based on the ability to understand the human and organizational dynamics that encompass the organization. She's also done a lot of work related to organizational culture, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Well, Caroline, thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me today, and I've been looking forward to this conversation that we're going to have about organizational culture.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. I'm also looking forward to this conversation.
So, where I'd want to start is just to ask you, how did you first become interested in organizational culture, and how did this become one of the focuses for your consulting?
Good question. So I started, I guess you could say, my career in different forms of doing change, change management, change leadership, and was working on a lot of, call them large scale change projects, which often were IT related. So wanting to do implementations of new systems or changing systems or processes. And there was always something that I felt would hit like a wall in the process of what we were doing. And back in the day, and I'm talking, maybe 15 years ago, change management, I think, was seen as something that was very almost, I'm going to use the word mechanistic. You followed a template, you followed a process, and it was something that almost attached itself to project management. And even though we call change management the people component of change, I think we had really forgotten the people perspective. And what I mean by that is we were concerned by creating stakeholder analysis and different maps, resistance maps, and risk analysis. So we became a little bit like an extension of project management. And even with these great plans and this great strategy that we'd have in place around how we'd communicate, when we'd communicate, and where resistance might emerge from, something always in my mind was tripping us up. And there was a lot of things. I mean, we can say there were probably at least 10 variables, but the thing that really became evident for me was the culture of the organization.
Okay.
Trying to make a change in a system where you were going really counter to what the culture was deemed to fail. And what I mean by that is, I'll give you an example. We were working on a project at one time where the organization wanted to shift a lot of their systems from what we would call sort of single view, where I'd be working and only seeing my material and my stuff, to going to a system that was more collaborative and open view. So now you would be seeing what your colleagues were doing, and there would be transparency around accountabilities. Well, initially, when they were thinking about how to take the old out and put the new in, it was very, again, mechanistic around, the dates of which one would cut over from the other and how data would be migrated. And the more we talked about, well, why would people want to embark on this? So, of course, as we did our interviewing with people to try to understand what might be in it for them
Right.
and what would lead them to want to embark on this, one of the things that became very obvious to me is that even if individuals as a person decided that this was good for them, everything in the culture of that organization was built to be individualistic and to be competitive.
Right. Okay.
So it was not a culture built around collaboration or around transparency or cross functionality. So I started to research because I didn't really know much about culture per se, but I was trying to understand, well, then what is this overlay? Because even if an individual here and there says, yeah, okay, this could be good and can help improve my work and might facilitate my process, what's going to get in the way overall? And what I came to know as culture, the fact that the culture was one that was not made to be promoting collective work. It was made to promote individualistic work. Everything from the way they were measured, the way they were recognized, the way they were given their bonuses. So I started to understand that there was going to be a problem in implementing this kind of change because it really went counterculture.
Right. So, Carolyn, I think probably before we go any farther, it might be useful to just make sure that that we're talking about the same thing. And so I just wonder, what is your working definition of organizational culture, or what's your practical definition of this very important concept?
Yeah, good question. And there are many definitions out there. And I like to sort of boil it down to a very basic summary that it's the DNA of the organization. And by that, it's everything that goes into how the organization operates. So it's the values, it's the norms, it's the behaviors. It's a lot of the unsaid. It's the assumptions we carry, the beliefs we hold. So it's really a lot of that deep embedded, some people call it the personality of the organization.
Right. Yeah. So I think the way you're talking about it sounds very similar to the way that I think about it, and the way that I see some of the scholars who I particularly like talk about it. It's usually something that's intangible, and whatever else, whatever you're going to put in the culture bucket, most people put values, organizational values in, and norms, and certain important assumptions about the way the world works and how we do things around here.
Yeah, that's another good way to put it, is how we do things around here.
Yeah. So now, thinking about working on a project that has some kind of cultural dimension, I sometimes hear people talk about the need to become aware of this thing that we take for granted, and that makes me wonder, are there some ways in which a consultant can help a client to become more aware of their culture and what its constituents are? Is there some way of doing like a cultural assessment or an inventory or something?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I think over the years, one thing that's emerged out of this work are assessments, and you'll see, a couple on the market that are quite good. We use a few within our work, and they've got value because it creates a dialogue, right? And if we talk about culture and trying to surface norms and behaviors, it's not always easy to ask in a very direct question. So the assessments are a way to help pull out certain things that are not obvious. When we ask people to identify what it's like to live in this organization, they don't always know how to put words to it. So the assessments allow us to start from something somewhat objective around what some companies call culture patterns. And the patterns are identified on different bases of what makes up an organization. So when we do use assessments, it's one means by which we help the organization to surface. From that data, we hold dialogue groups and forums, because the data now has to have meaning for people. So even though you do an assessment, so what? Data is data, and data only has meaning when people come together and give it a meaning.
Right.
So what we do is we facilitate a lot of dialogue. We use different creative means to also help further the picture. We do something called culture snapshot workshops, where you can have people come and not just use words, but creative means to identify their culture, either by using what we call culture cards, images, drawings, and sometimes it's just freehand. There's some people who are more comfortable with that and will like to express it in different ways. We've had opportunities where everyone now, especially with digital cameras, it's very easy to walk around your organization and capture images of what you think are identification of your culture, and then have conversations about why this image, what is the story behind the image, what's it telling us about how we operate. And when we talk about culture change, it's a beast. Because the accepted, if you will, in the literature timeframes, especially in large organizations, it could take 5 to 10 years to turn a culture.
Right. Yeah.
So, the question often becomes, where do we start?
Yeah.
So assessments are a good starting point to at least help us hone in on what does it look like today? And is it what we want to be? And what is it that we want and need to be to get to that next
Yeah.
level of success?
Yeah, I wonder about that in part because my experience has been that on a surprising number of occasions, I have been working with, or at least interacting with, leaders of an organization, and they're having a conversation, let's say, about their values, and it becomes apparent after talking to them a bit that their idea is, well, we're gonna create the values of the organization. We're gonna create the values, and I'm listening to this and I'm thinking to myself, well, if organizational values actually exist, and this is a meaningful kind of phrase, and I believe they do exist,
Yeah.
it's not so much that the senior leaders sit down at a boardroom table and make some bullet point list of things and they say, those are our values, let's make a poster, put it up in the lunchroom, and all this kind of stuff. No, the values already exist in your organization. They're evident in the behavior of the people, and it's not so much that we're going to set the values, but rather we're going to discover the values, by through some sort of exploratory process that's going to bring, that which is currently below the surface or hidden into the light of day, so we can look at them and say, well, these are our values, and are these serving us well?
Yeah, very well said. And this is a challenge we're often confronted with is people who believe that because five executives sat in a boardroom and developed the values, that that's good enough, and then that the job is then to communicate them out. And this is where often, in my humble opinion, that's the mistake. Is
Yeah.
it's not a document to communicate out. It is something, as you just said, that has to be felt and lived by everybody within the organization. And there's lip service often paid to values, to your point, posters up on walls.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because when we come into organizations, and one of the first things we often will do is different types of interviews, and people will almost 9 out of 10 times say to us, yeah, you see those things on the wall? Full of baloney.
Right.
Because again, they weren't espoused. No one really was asked, are these the values that you believe are at play? So therefore they become, really, it's a non-starter.
Yeah. My worry is, when I run into something like that, often, for me at least, the way it's occurring for me is these leaders, these
Mhm.
leaders, they're terrific people,
Yeah.
and what they've come up with is a wonderful set of values. It really sounds terrific. It's
Yeah.
just that it's fiction. And if
Yeah.
if what then happens is what you just described, that okay, they start communicating them out and they make the posters and so on, and they're very different from the lived experience of the
Yeah.
people in the organization, that the effect produced by that could be cynicism.
Exactly.
So instead of getting these five very nice values, what you create is cynicism, or something like that, which is very different from the intention. And I feel so bad for
Yeah.
organizational leaders who start down that path, and it must get so
Yeah.
frustrating for them when they produce these unintended effects like that.
Yeah. What's interesting about what you're saying, Jamie, is I think it's sort of how people were brought up in their leadership style,
Yeah.
because, and I don't like to necessarily talk about generational because I don't always believe that it's just a generational thing. But if I look at today, I'm just looking within our client base, um, working with some of the, call them under 30s, who are these co-founders of companies and up and coming. um, it doesn't even dawn on them to do it by themselves sitting in a room. Like, it's just not part of their philosophy of maybe how they were brought up. And when I say brought up, I don't mean by their parents, but what they experience in organizations or what they believe organizations to be, versus maybe someone who's been around a long time and has experienced different things from the more hierarchical leadership style, and therefore, not ill intended, but this is what they know. And
Right.
it's what's worked, but it's not working anymore. I mean, it hasn't worked for a long time, but I think now, because of the emergence of what we're calling the millennials, or whatever term you want to give them,
Right.
they're expecting different. They want different. They don't want this old, you tell me, you're the boss, and therefore. So I think I'm noticing an actual call it little revolution almost, where it's just not being accepted.
Yeah.
So it's pushing leaders to have to think differently about their leadership style, which is very uncomfortable for a lot of leaders who grew up in a more hierarchical kind of way.
Yeah.
And not in ill intended, it's just what they knew. So the question becomes, are these folks of that style of leadership ready and willing to change their leadership style or not?
Yeah. Yeah. Curious. Well, I'll
Yeah.
tell you another thing that I'm wondering about is how a leadership group and how an organizational consultant like you is able to determine that a
Mhm.
particular aspiration, a particular
Mhm.
desire for change has cultural implications. So, a very quick example: I was working with a group of healthcare people in Ontario not too long ago, and they'd organized themselves into a community of practice. And their members came from long-term care homes and various outreach programs from across the province, and they were interested in the issue of oral health care
Mm.
for very elderly people. And they were concerned that in some long-term care homes, the personal support workers were not providing a sufficient level and type of oral health care that was tailored to the needs of this elderly population. So,
Right.
so that they this was, you might say, this is sort of a technical issue. There's a
Mhm.
certain kind of care that is needed, and it can be
Right.
demonstrated, and certain tools are needed, and so on. And so what they did was they began this process of creating education and training and awareness raising, activities of various sorts to start bringing about this change. And they told me once they were well into this project that they had discovered that the only way they were going to be successful is if they were able to change the culture of the long-term care homes they were working with. And to me, I was sort of flabbergasted because I had in my head this has to do with brushing your teeth, and
Right.
now it's culture. And so I just wonder, how does
Yeah.
that happen? How do we know that a change in fact has cultural
Mm. Yeah.
ramifications?
That's a really good question because, we often go around that question ultimately when we come into a system. One thing I think we've gotten pretty good at is what we call our discovery phase.
Okay.
So when we come into the system, we don't want to take at face value that what we're hearing is indeed what the problem is, if you want to, call it that. But to really go and explore and to ask a lot of questions, because to your point, and I think we've all been there where we think it's going this way, but then we find out there's a real paradigm issue. Like, and I don't know what was going on in your organization, but I'm going to lend an example because I came from healthcare, from health and social
Okay.
services way back when, and there was a lot of ageist attitudes that existed, even by people who gave care to people who were elderly. And so there were these ethical debates sometimes about sort of things about quality of care. So it's interesting that you bring up the dental thing because I recall a conversation many moons ago where someone made a comment like, well, not exactly who cares about, like, their teeth are going to fall out anyways, but it was almost in that kind of vein where this embedded paradigm or belief about aging and about the fact that you're going to eat your food through a straw anyways, so who cares about your teeth? And that actually used to be a belief that, so what, that you would lose your teeth and have dentures, whereas nowadays even dentists don't want you losing your teeth. But just to say, I'm not shocked in a way that
Okay.
you
Yeah.
you know you were up against what maybe people believe to be necessary or not necessary.
Right.
So how do we discover those things? I mean, you don't always get a chance to know it 100%, but when we say discovery, we come in, and sometimes we meet resistance because people will say to us, well, isn't it enough that you met the director general or that you spoke to the president? Our short answer is no. because you only hold one piece of the story and you only see things from your view. So we need a larger understanding of the system. Um, we do sometimes, like I said, meet with resistance because they see it as, oh, it's going to take a lot of time and why is it necessary and how much is this going to cost us? But the reality is, it's better to do it up front and to know possibly that this is going to be a roadblock rather than have it hit midway through and then it's hard to go back and unravel.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And then people aren't so interested in scaling it back because they feel like they're too invested. So we spend a lot of time up front, um, and it's worth it because we don't discover everything. Obviously, there's always surprises.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
so yeah, like that's interesting that you also have done some you have some experience working
Yeah.
in that area. In another project that I've been involved in recently, that had to do with prescribing patterns in let's say long-term care homes.
Hmm.
Um, One of the things that came out from, and these were statements made by people working in those environments, doctors, nurse practitioners, nurses, personal support workers, administrators, that came out was this idea that part of the culture in those environments is the healthcare we provide has to do with maintenance, not with curing,
Yeah.
you know,
Hmm.
and you can sort of understand that, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
but at the same time, it's so interesting because
Mm.
it shapes behavior. And to me, it was a real revelation about how culture influences and shapes behavior. Because what we were working on was the need to the need to be more cautious about prescribing multiple medications to very elderly people because of possible adverse drug
Yeah.
interactions and
Yeah.
because drugs can make people dizzy and
Of
dizzy
course.
people
Yeah.
can fall down and elderly people who fall down break their hips and
Great things.
elderly
Yeah.
people who break their hips are, you know, there's a much greater risk of dying within the
Yeah.
next short while. So these were, you know, literally life and death questions, but the
Absolutely.
culture of maintenance was leading to behavior that said, let's not worry too much if we've got, you know, 15 drugs with this person. They look okay right now. Let's move on to something else, you know.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that these were not caring and
Oh,
compassionate
absolutely.
people, but rather the kind of culture in the organization was producing this behavior.
Oh, 100%. And you're bringing me back to debates we would have about prevention versus intervention.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's been an age old. And I don't know that we've solved it. But again, depending on, I worked in different institutions of different natures, some more acute care, some pre back into community. So depending where you were, but if you didn't believe in prevention or prevention wasn't your philosophy, of course, it permeated the culture of the organization and how everything was decided, how your policies were written, how care was emitted. So, for sure, what you believe becomes your culture.
Yeah.
And people don't often make that link. They don't see how our beliefs are attached to the culture of the organization. And that's where people have a hard time articulating who are we, and they'll come out with statements like, well, we're a long-term care center. Okay, yes, but who are you behind that? Because not every long-term care center is the same,
Oh yeah. Yeah. That's right.
and they have different personalities, but helping them to identify the personality of where they are working
Yeah.
is the fun part, the challenge.
So okay. So let's say then
Mhm.
you know you've done a good discovery process. You know
Yeah.
you've been asked to come in and work with a client on something. You've done the good discovery process. One of the realizations that comes out of that is that in order for this client system to take effective action on the aspirations that you know that they've been talking
Mhm.
about, this is going to involve a culture change.
Right.
So, you know, the obvious question then is, well, okay, what then?
What
How
then?
does a consultant and organizational members, how do they intentionally change
Hmm.
culture?
Yeah. Well, first, there has to be, a term I heard this morning with a client that they use in their system a lot is intellectual and emotional buy-in. And I thought that was really interesting to distinguish because intellectual buy-in is easy. to say yes, yes, yes to something, but emotional buy-in means I really commit and I'm ready to put myself under the microscope because it has to start with me. So, our philosophy, anyways, at the way we work is when we come to that conversation with initially the leadership team, and we say, look, there's something that's a discrepancy, there's an incongruency here between your strategy and your culture. Because that's the way we'll frame it. We'll say, your strategy tells you you want to be here. Your culture is actually taking you somewhere else, or it's dragging you down. There's possibility culture drag. And so, in this process of coming to this realization, is you have to be ready and willing as leaders to take a look first and foremost at yourself. Because if you believe, which I strongly do believe, that culture is amplified by leader behavior, not necessarily strictly shaped by, but it's amplified by. I really believe that. The leaders need to be ready and willing to put themselves under a microscope and question their own values and question their own assumptions and question why they make decisions the way they make them. That's the emotional buy-in that they have to be ready to commit to.
Right. Okay.
And that's not an easy one. We've gone around this many, many a time saying, how do you really detect motivation and commitment? You can have conversations, you can try to do little assessments, but ultimately people can dupe you and say yes, 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 and then not really be committed. So we try to suss out motivation by, like I said, a lot of one-on-one conversations and by doing small activities in groups to see what the uptake is and what the engagement is. Because honestly, if they're not ready to be all in,
Yeah.
we won't start a process with the organization. It's setting it up for failure, and it's not fair to the system to ask people to embark on something that leaders themselves are not prepared to put in some elbow grease on.
Right. Okay. I just want to say, I love that image, that leader behavior amplifies culture. I love that. I've never heard that before. That's very, very
No,
nice.
yeah, I don't know where I got it from. I'm sure I didn't coin it, but
Yeah, that's nice.
yeah.
Well, I'm going to be quoting you on that anyhow, because
No,
you're my source.
thank you.
Yeah. So, well, that also then reminds me of another thing that comes out in a lot of discussions about culture, and that is this: that okay, so we want, I'm using the same sort of phrase just to kind of frame our conversation a little bit. The organization has an aspiration to change, and the change has some sort of cultural ramification or cultural dimension. Is it essential that the change start at the top, or
Yeah.
is it possible to go in at a different level in the organization to work on the change there with the expectation that it's going to ripple out through the organization, not from the top, but from somewhere else in the organization? Where do you stand on that?
So I'll tell you, this is where I have my neurotic self because I have this ideal self that likes to believe in, I'm going to use a very maybe harsh term, but the tyranny of the masses. I love to believe in people power and the fact that emergence can happen from the bottom, so to speak, and that with enough fuel behind the mass, that something can shift.
Right.
My experience so far, unfortunately, has been that it hasn't worked. I haven't seen it work, but I don't lose hope that it can work. What I mean by that is because what happens is I've seen it where, there's dissatisfaction in different parts of the organization. And people come together and say, how can we change things? And this is where the conversation between climate and culture comes into play, because the climate is what people feel and it's what they observe, and it's the piece of culture that is more the mood, right?
Okay.
So people start to feel like something's not working for them, they're not liking certain things, and they want to see a shift happen. So they start to have a little bit of impact, possibly on their team and their domain, their unit, whatever you want to call it, because they can change certain things that change the mood. So maybe they're going to change how they feed back to each other. They're going to change how they recognize each other. They're going to help each other in whatever way possible to create a more sort of servant kind of leadership model. But then they try to amplify that throughout the organization and create some momentum. That's where I think it becomes very challenging, because culture, like we said, is really the deep embedded values and norms and behaviors that are ingrained and have to be amplified by the leadership.
Right.
So, how deep and how far can they make these changes if they're going to always be hit by this cement wall that's going to push them back down?
Yeah.
Um, we have read cases where boards put out CEOs because they didn't like the way the CEO was running the organization. I mean, we see it in Uber recently, right? A great example of someone who was killing the culture, and the leadership behavior was horrible. And therefore, the board took a decision. Now, was that a result of people in the organization? Not sure. I think it was media pressure,
Right. Yeah.
right? And shareholders. So I'm not really answering your question, but what I'm saying is I like to believe it's possible. I haven't yet seen it. My experience has been that without solid leadership buy-in and commitment,
Yeah.
the best efforts end up only going to a certain extent, and then the change is more at a surface, which is what we call the climate of the organization. But to hit the deep values and behaviors, I think, because not only does it take leader behavior, it takes everyone being aligned. So if you're
Yeah.
missing a critical mass of your organization, then how do you, I don't know. It's a tricky one.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you, Carolyn, that, it would be nice to think that there is the possibility that beneficial change in an organization can start from somewhere other than the top when it needs to. And
Mhm.
I think we could say that scholars might say anyhow that theoretically we can see that there is a theoretical possibility
Yeah.
of that happening, but practitioners, I'm thinking of some of the original guys like Richard Beckhardt and Edgar Schein, they tended to say that Beckhardt actually was very clear on this. You've got to start at the top,
Yeah.
and it does seem to me that it's hard to argue against that in a hierarchical organization. And in fact, I can recall
Mm.
a project that my colleagues and I worked on a number of years ago, where we started the project. There was strong support from the top. It was culture change, so it was going to take years. And a
Right.
couple of years into the project, making good progress, there was a change in the CEO. And the new CEO was like a totally different person and was not at all supportive of the new culture that the departed CEO had been hoping to bring about. It was a more collaborative culture, a
Mm.
culture that you and I probably would rather like.
Yeah.
And the guy that came in was kind of an old-fashioned command and control
Mm.
top down manager. And what we experienced over time was an ethical dilemma,
No.
because it was almost like, were we to continue, then are we setting up people that we're working with at lower levels in the organization, to be punished?
Right.
And so, yeah, it was a very real ethical dilemma that
Yeah.
we had to figure out how we were gonna respond to. So yeah. Yeah, so I'm sort of I'm also a little cautious about this. I'm aware that the dialogic organization development people,
Hmm.
there was a book that came out a couple of years ago, and it's this new approach that opposes itself to what they call diagnostic
Right.
OD. Those people make the claim that you can go anywhere in an organization, and it's, although I like a lot of what they say, that's one that's one bit of advice that they give that I'm not prepared to enthusiastically embrace just yet.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I if someone can show me how and where it was done, And maybe in a smaller system that was built on more what we call self-led teams, or more what we call a flat organization,
Right.
I can see where that would make a lot of sense,
Yeah.
because power has never been centralized.
Right. Or in a network
Right.
organization of some kind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
But
possible.
where it was formally set up to have a chain of command almost, oh yeah, it's going against the culture again, and maybe with time and effort. But and again, this morning you're having this conversation with a client because the two sponsors of this project, and it is a culture shift, they're considered disruptors in the system. um, and they're high enough in the organization to be disruptors,
Okay.
but even at that, they're having to hold their wits about them.
Right.
And every so often we have to go in for a rah to help them, because it's hard to not feel deflated sometimes when you go into your management committee and they're like, you're a punching bag.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to keep them motivated with the notion that when you're a disruptor, you will be someone's punching bag, because you are challenging the norm. You are taking people outside their comfort zone. And it's really hard to be that person in a system,
Yeah.
because you have to hold down the consequences of people's dissatisfaction or discomfort. So, um, is it doable? Yeah, but you need people also with huge courage
Yes.
and willingness to be on the outs sometimes, and to not be liked.
Yeah.
And that's a hard place to be when you are especially if we're talking about personality styles, and someone who likes harmony and who likes to be liked. And now for me to be a disruptor and to stand outside the norm, it's a big role to play.
Right. Yeah. Well, Caroline, I want to thank you for giving so generously of your time this
Pleasure.
afternoon. This has been very interesting. Now, just before we conclude, I just want to see if there's any final thoughts you would like to share about working with an organization's culture.
Personally, I think the thing that we as practitioners need to remember is that it's not our win or loss. And I think sometimes it's the thing that's hard is to swallow our own, call it egos or pride, and that we have to allow people the journey that they need to be on. And sometimes our challenge is to not want to push them in a direction that they're not ready to go in. So that's the balance in the kind of work we do, is honoring how much the system can handle at any one time and what they're willing to handle. So it's not about us, it's about them, but withholding the fact that we're not experts, but yet we do have something to offer. So it's finding that way to bring our quote unquote expertise, but without spewing expertise on them, and allowing them to drive the process.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Wonderful concluding thoughts. So thank you again very much for your time. And I'm
Pleasure.
sure that we will be having you back here at some point in the future.
I look forward to it. Thanks so much, Jamie.
Okay. You can find out more about Caroline, and you can reach her through her website, which is at www.thepillars.ca. Please check back with the Human Systems Intervention channel soon so you can stay up to date with our regular postings. I'm going to be speaking with quite a few skilled practitioners and also some scholars in the coming months on topics such as the importance of linking change management with project management, designing complex collaborative processes, working with toxic and recalcitrant cultures, pursuing development through mentoring, social innovation, the art of convening, helping a client system to think outside the box, and much more. You can also learn about the Human Systems Intervention Masters Program by visiting the program website, and I'm showing you here the URL that will get you directly to that website. Okay, see you next time.